This is lecture 19, part 1 of chapter 13. We're looking at how populations evolve. We're going to be talking about Charles Darwin and my time at the San Diego Zoo. So my brother and I used to work at the San Diego Zoo. And take a look at the background here. Can I get off this thing wherever I want? Darwin says, yes, you can. And if you don't know why that's funny, you will by the end of this lecture. So let's get into Charles Darwin. So we're going to be talking about Darwin's theory of evolution during this lecture. Then we'll be talking about the evolution of populations as well as mechanisms of microevolution. So let's get into Darwin's theory of evolution. So a sea voyage helped Darwin frame his theory of evolution. And I want to preface this by reminding you something we learned about in the first week. So when we talk about a theory in science, a theory is a big deal. A theory is something that is replicable. It's something that scientists have tested over and over again and have gotten similar or identical results every time. So gravity is a theory. A theory is a thing in science. So when we're talking about the theory of evolution, evolution is a thing. So when we're talking about evolution, evolution in its most simplest form is the process of change over time. And specifically for this class, we're going to be talking about evolution as the change in the frequency of a gene or allele in a population over time. And I want to point out that word population, because when we're talking about evolution, we're talking on the population level. So we knew for quite a while that evolution was happening, the process of change over time. We knew that things were changing over time. And I want to point out that evolution is a process, right? So we knew that the process of change over time was happening, but we didn't know the mechanism by which it was happening. And actually, Darwin wasn't the first one to propose a mechanism of evolution. So one of the first most prevalent ideas was from a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was a French naturalist from the mid 1700s to the early 1800s. And he was most famous for his theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, which he published in 1801. So this idea stated that if an organism changes during its life, in order to adapt to its environment, those changes are passed on to its offspring. This is also known as use it or lose it. So the idea behind this was that if the environment changed and an organism needed to change along with it, they could spontaneously adapt to meet the needs of their environment, and that those adaptations would be passed on to their offspring. Also, if there was some kind of adaptation that they had that they weren't using, they could lose it, and then that would not be passed on to their offspring. So a good example of this is with giraffes. So the idea here is that, maybe back in the day, giraffes had these normal short necks, but they ate all the plants off of that level of the trees, they ate all the leaves from that level. So now the food is higher up. So they stretched their necks to reach higher until they ate all of that. So then it stretched its neck even more to reach up even higher, and then stretched its neck. This is all the same giraffe until it was the length that we see today. Because once it stretched its neck to reach those leaves, and then passed that on to the offspring. If you look at the picture in the bottom, think of like, do it for the kids, honey. Stretch, stretch. And he's like, okay, I got this. And he stretches his neck on purpose in order to reach higher into the trees and then passes that on. So that's the idea of Lamarckian inheritance. If you've ever read Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Book, he wrote another book called Just So Stories. One of my favorites is How the Elephant Got Its Trunk. And it's about this precocious little elephant who goes down to the river and bothers it's an alligator or a crocodile. And this little elephant has a short little nose, right? They had short, normal little noses back then until this precocious little elephant goes and bothers that poor alligator crocodile, which then bites his nose, and the alligator crocodile pulls, and the baby elephant pulls, the alligator crocodile thing pulls, and the baby elephant pulls until eventually his trunk is really long. And then apparently he was also like super good with the ladies, because then he passed on a ton of his genes, and now you see all giraffes or all elephants have that long nose, that long trunk. And so it's the Just So Stories are a whole collection of stories kind of like that. But any of the parents in the audience, you know that if we were able to like spontaneously adapt, like if we could just spontaneously make more arms, we would have done it already, right? So this idea of Lamarckian inheritance, the use it or lose it, being able to just spontaneously make adaptations and pass them on, is not true. This is not actually what's going on. But this idea of Lamarckian inheritance was one of the first proposed mechanisms of evolution that people believed for quite a while, until we got more evidence that this is not what is going on. So next came a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a British naturalist, early 1800s to early 1900s, and he came up with this idea that organisms are born with a set of adaptations, and some of those adaptations are going to be better suited to the environment than others. Whichever organisms happen to have the traits that were the best adaptations for the current environment would be more successful, meaning they would reproduce more and pass their genes on more. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should. I just described Darwin's theory of natural selection, but we're talking about Alfred Russel Wallace. So what gives? So here's what gives. Charles Darwin, to give you the brief version before we launch into the full version of Charles Darwin, was a fairly well-to-do Englishman, and he hopped aboard the HMS Beagle and sailed around the world. Actually, not even as a naturalist, that was just his hobby. But Darwin would get off the boat and make observations of what he saw. And he took tons and tons of notes. He took it home with him, and then he kind of sat on that information for like several decades. Now, when you see pictures of Charles Darwin, you always see pictures of like this really old man with a white beard. Well, Charles Darwin was actually fairly young when he went on the Beagle. He was like in his early 20s, I think. And so he sat on this information that he got for quite a while. Well, during that time period, Alfred Russel Wallace independently came up with the idea of natural selection. Now, neither of them actually called it natural selection, but the idea is the same. We now call it natural selection. Anyway, so Alfred Russel Wallace came up with this idea. He wrote it up in a manuscript, but before he published it, he wanted to send it to a very credible, well-known and respected naturalist to get his opinion first before submitting it to the publisher. So Alfred Russel Wallace sent his manuscript to none other than Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin took a read through the manuscript and went, oh shoot, this is what I was eventually going to get around to publishing. So Darwin published his work first real quick, and then sent Wallace's manuscript back to him saying, oh, this is wonderful. Good job, Alfred. Too bad I already published it. And so that is why, even though Alfred Russel Wallace was going to get this idea out first, it is Charles Darwin who is credited with coming up with the idea of natural selection. So Charles Darwin was an English naturalist. During the 1800s, went on a 5-year trip around the world on the HMS Beagle. Again, he wasn't even hired as a naturalist. That was just his hobby, as rich white men were able to do back then. And when he got off the boat, he would make observations about organisms he would see off the ship. And he took copious notes, most famous from the Galapagos Islands. And he wrote a book about his findings called On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. If you are ever having trouble sleeping, read On the Origin of Species. It is full of very, very fascinating information, told in a very boring way. I recommend you read somebody else's take on the origin of species if you're interested in the information in there. But it is full of very good information, including a description of natural selection, even though, like I said, he never actually uses the term natural selection, but he does describe it. We just put the label to it later. But Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolution. So we're going to take a little look at some of the experiments that he did. So his most famous experiments, not really even experiments, they were just observations. He wasn't actually manipulating anything. He would just get off the boat and make observations. But some of his most famous observations were made on the Galapagos Islands. Now, islands are great for studying evolution because originally all of those animals were probably from the same population, and then they got split as the islands diverged. And so you can actually kind of see, you can trace evolution on those different islands. And so one of his most famous examples were finches, a type of bird. And as he traveled around to different islands, and even on the same island, if he was on different sides in different like little micro environments, he was able to observe some differences in their beaks. So if you take a look at this, you'll notice that the beaks are all just a little bit different. And the reason that they're a little bit different is because of what they eat. And so if you take a look down here, the tree finches have these kind of shorter and a little more broad beaks. You know, these, we get the grasping beaks who are trying to like reach down and grab insects. We've got some crushing beaks, like the big broad ones who eat seeds and have to crush those seeds. So it makes sense they have bigger, broader beaks. And so Darwin was able to take a look at these beaks and he could pretty accurately guess what food they were eating, or he could look at the food available and guess what type of beak the finches were going to have. And so he was able to kind of trace like, oh, there's some kind of relationship between the type of beak these birds have and the food that they're eating. And so then he was having to think of, you know, how that would happen, how the beaks would look different depending on what they were eating. So from all of these different observations, all the different notes that he took, he made some key observations, and from of those key observations, he made several inferences. So the first observation that Charles Darwin made was that all species have huge potential fertility. That means that all species have the ability to have lots of babies. Second observation, except for seasonal changes, populations tend to maintain a stable size. So if you go into an area and you know there's X number of deer, from year to year, there's probably going to be about the same number of deer, you know, given for seasonal fluctuations, but there's going to be about the same number. That is because, observation number 3, environmental resources are limited. So these species can be having lots and lots of babies, but there's only so many resources to go around. So here's Darwin's first inference. The production of more individuals, of more babies than the environment can support, leads to a struggle for existence, and only a small number of those offspring survive in each generation. So, next observation, no two individuals in a population are exactly alike. Next observation, much of the observed variation, those different adaptations, are heritable. So here's his next inference. Survival in this struggle for existence is not random, but it depends in part on the hereditary makeup of the survivors. Those individuals who inherit characteristics that allow them to best exploit their environment, to best get the resources they need, are likely to leave more offspring than individuals who are less well suited to their environment. So if you happen to have the adaptations that best match the environment, you're going to be the most successful, you're going to be the healthiest, you're going to survive longer, and most importantly, you're going to have more babies. And this was the idea of survival of the fittest. And he made another inference on this, that unequal reproduction between suited and unsuited organisms, those best suited to the environment and those not well suited to the environment, will eventually cause a gradual change in the population. So if those who are best suited are reproducing the most, those are the genes you're going to see in the next generation. And if the environment doesn't change too much in that next generation, you're going to assume that those are the genes you're going to see in the generation after that. And so the characteristics that are favorable to that particular environment are going to accumulate over generations. And so it's not just, you know, beaks that we're looking at, but it could be any number of different characteristics. And those are going to build up over time. And whichever ones are best suited to the environment are going to get passed on from generation to generation until we have this kind of suite of the best adaptations for the current environment. So take a look at this picture. Is this what we mean by survival of the fittest? Like, I am the fittest, I am the strongest. Is it always the strongest? The answer is no, it's not always the strongest. So natural selection, or survival of the fittest, really means that organisms that are better adapted to an environment survive and reproduce more than others. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be strength, right? It could be intelligence. It could be something like opposable thumbs. You know, there's any number of adaptations that could make someone best suited or the fittest. And so really you can think about it as reproduction of the fittest, because really what we care about is how many babies you have. Grandma was right all along, and life is really all about having babies. But the goal of organisms is to pass on their genes. And so according to natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution is happening, organisms that are better adapted to an environment survive and reproduce more than others. So we're really talking about reproduction of the fittest. So let's break down Darwin's theory of natural selection. It occurs in 4 steps: overproduction, variation, competition, and selection. So let's take a look at each of these different steps. So the first step is overproduction. Organisms are capable of producing huge numbers of offspring, more than can actually survive. Because, we'll get to that, variation. Those offspring are variable in appearance and function, and some of those variations are heritable. And so all organisms have different adaptations. Every organism is a little bit different from all of the other ones. And those variations, some of them at least, are heritable. So I've been throwing around the word adaptation. So let's actually take a look at what adaptations are before we move on to number 3. So an adaptation is a heritable physical or behavioral trait that helps an organism survive. So it's usually something on an organism's body that helps them better exploit their environment. And so we have the actual adaptation, and then we have the function of that adaptation. What does that adaptation do? So let's look at a couple of examples of this. So take a look at this picture. You'll see this owl, right? And so what is an adaptation of this owl? I'm going to pause like you're actually going to answer me. So I want you to say it or something. I can hear you. Yeah, so one of the adaptations of this owl is its white feathers. So the white feathers, the camouflage, is the adaptation, right? The white feathers are the adaptation. The function of that adaptation is to blend into its environment, because this owl usually lives in the snow. So the actual adaptation of the white feathers, the function of that adaptation is to blend it, to camouflage with its environment. Let's do another one. Ooh, so what is an adaptation of this lion? Yeah, it's sharp teeth. So the sharp teeth are the adaptation. What is the function of that adaptation? To catch and kill and eat its delicious prey. So the adaptation is the sharp teeth. The function is to help it catch and rip apart prey. Okay, let's do another. How about the anglerfish? What's an adaptation of an anglerfish? Yeah, so this light, it has this little bioluminescent little bob on top, and it's actually used kind of like a fishing lure. So the bioluminescent thing on its head is the adaptation, and the function of that adaptation is to lure in its prey. And by the way, these things look ridiculously scary in real life. They're like this big. They're not as terrifying as they seem. How about this picture? Can you even see what's in it? So in case you can't spot it, there is a tiger in this picture. I used to work at the San Diego Zoo, and I'd give private tours, and I would always tell people that tigers have some of the best camouflage in the animal kingdom. And my wonderful guests would always be like, no, they don't, I see it, it's right there. Right? Well, tigers do actually have some of the best camouflage in the animal kingdom, even though it doesn't always look like it to us, because most of a tiger's prey sees in grayscale, so black and white and gray. And if we go back to the last picture, in grayscale, orange is about the same color as green. And so tigers actually blend into the grass fairly well. And then with those black stripes, they really do just look like grass, and they're stalking predators. So they'll get down real low and they'll be real quiet and go real slow through that grass and then pounce on their prey at the last second. So that camouflage is actually really, really good. If you ever get a chance to look at a tiger, on the back of each ear, there's a big white spot. Scientists think that that big white spot is because their camouflage is so good that even mom can't see the kids as they're playing in the grass. And so she looks for the white dots bobbing through the grass to keep track of the cubs. So actually amazing camouflage for the tiger. Good. All right, so step number 3 of natural selection is competition. So environmental resources are limited, and those varied offspring must compete for their share if they are to survive. So when we're talking about environmental resources, we could be talking about food, we could be talking about space, we could be talking about mates, right? Any of the things that organisms need to survive and pass on their genes that are limited in quantity. And so then comes selection. So organisms have a bunch of babies. Those babies have heritable variations, but survival is restricted by the amount of resources available. So the question becomes, who survives? That's where selection comes in. So survival and reproduction of those varied offspring is not random. Those individuals whose inherited characteristics, whose adaptations make them better able to compete for resources will live longer and, most importantly, have more offspring than those not able to compete for those limited resources. So that is natural selection in a nutshell. And I've actually had an example of this in the background. Ooh, this is one of my original lectures, and I still get all excited about it because I was super clever. Anyway, so this is a peppered moth in the background. And so on the left, you're looking at the pre-industrial revolution era. Most of the trees were white, and there are 2 different variants of this moth. So there's a white variant and a black variant. And if you were a bird, birds like to eat these, which one of these moths would you eat? Nom, 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 the black one, because it's easier to spot, right? And I know at the zoo, we used to always say animals become lazy and will only expend the amount of energy they absolutely have to. So if you can get the easy food, you're going to go for the easy food. So birds would usually go after the black moths. So there were many, many more white moths because they camouflage better. Well, then during the Industrial Revolution, it actually stained the trees black. And so now if you take a look, same variants, white and black, but now the trees they live on are black. If you were a bird, which one of these would you eat now? Nom, 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 the white ones, right? Because now they're easier to spot, which means the black ones are going to reproduce more. So then in the next generation, we're going to have more black than white. That, my friends, is natural selection, evolution happening. So let's go back to the theory of evolution. So again, it's the process of change over time, more specifically, the change in the frequency of a gene or allele in a population over time. So when we were looking at the peppered moth, it's that white allele versus the black allele, and how when the environment changed, now all of a sudden that black allele was more favorable. It allowed them to compete better. So they survived and they had the most babies. That is evolution in action. So I do again want to point out this word population, because don't get it confused. There is a myth that an individual can evolve. An individual does not evolve, right? We learned that with Lamarckian inheritance. You can't just spontaneously make adaptations in order to evolve. You are born with a set of adaptations, and you just so happen to have the adaptations or not that match the environment. And so it's really by chance. You'll notice I say quite a bit, and the organisms that just so happen to have the adaptations, it's really by chance that you happen to be the best adapted to the current environment. And remember, the current environment can change. So when we're talking about evolution, we're not talking about an individual, we're talking about a population. So let's do a couple of examples of this. So take a look at this population of Eevees, right? We have our leafy Eevees, our water Eevees, and our fluffy Eevees. So this is the general population to start with. You'll notice not many trees, just a little bit of water. So now there's a flood and there's water everywhere. So if you take a look at this original population, which of these Eevees do you think just so happen to be best adapted to this new environment? Probably the water Eevees. So the next generation is going to look something like this. Notice there's still some fluffy Eevees, but oh, there's no tree Eevees left. Sad tree Eevees went extinct. All right, let's do another one. So same starting population, but now there's lots of trees that have grown. So which of those Eevees do you think are just so happen to be the best adapted to this current environment? Probably the leafy Eevees. And so we're going to see a population like this. Lots of leafy Eevees. These fluffy Eevees are just hanging in there, but no water Eevees. So over a period of time, selected traits can actually become so different, it leads to what we call speciation, which is the creation of a new species. You see this quite often on islands that have drifted apart, or just different populations that somehow get separated, where they end up getting so many different adaptations that are so different from the original population back in the day that they actually end up becoming a whole new species. And speciation, my friends, could be an entire class in and of itself, because scientists don't agree about what makes a species. We'll get into that in a later lecture, but just for now, know that over time, those selected traits can become so different that it leads to the creation of new species. But yes, it's the next chapter. But I want you to take a look at this picture again. Now, I mentioned that I used to work at the San Diego Zoo. So I have a little story for you. It's worth it, I promise. When you were kids, do you remember that adults used to tell you that there are no stupid questions? Well, I'm here to tell you that the adults were lying to you, and there are definitely stupid questions, and we heard them all at the zoo. So my brother and I both worked at the zoo for many years. I worked in tours on the tour buses, and he worked at Skyfari, that aerial tram. And we got asked the best, and by the best, I mean the worst questions. The most common question we both got asked was, where's the nearest bathroom? If you've ever been to the San Diego Zoo, that's a great question because the bathrooms are so hard to find. At buses, the second most common question we would get asked is, how long is the 35-minute tour? I'm not kidding. We would also have folks point to the bus and ask what the difference between the upper and the lower deck was. And we got asked that so much that we were actually allowed to say about 6 feet. My brother said at Skyfari, the second most common question they got was looking at these gondolas, right? They go up like 180 feet in the air. And the second most common question they would get asked is, can I get off this thing wherever I want? To which my brother would respond, Darwin says, yes, you can, which was a wonderful response because the people asking that question didn't realize that his answer was an insult. But now you do. If you're ever in the mood for some entertainment, check out the Darwin Awards. There's a series of books as well as a movie that has a cameo by Jamie and Adam from the Mythbusters. They sell a NATO rocket to somebody to strap on his car. But the Darwin Awards are basically, they're true stories of people who have done things so dumb that they took themselves out of the gene pool. And that was probably for the best of humanity. So check it out if you're in the mood for a good laugh. So the question that we get asked all the time as evolutionary biologists is, evolution usually does not happen quickly. Sometimes it does. Sometimes evolution does happen quickly. But usually when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, right? Evolution happens on a very large scale, on a very long time frame. And so if we're looking back millions of years, how do we actually know what happened, right? So one of the ways that we know what happened is by studying fossils, and fossils do provide very strong evidence for evolution. So fossils are the imprints or remains of organisms that lived in the past. They document differences between past and present organisms and reveal that many species have become extinct. There are many, many species that go extinct. And a quick note on that, because we often, we talk about anthropogenic climate change and anthropogenic induced extinction. And quite often the rebuttal to that is, well, species go extinct all the time. Like species go extinct naturally, which is true. But there's a baseline level of extinction. Like we would expect so many organisms to go extinct within a time frame. And the number of organisms going extinct right now is far beyond that baseline rate. And so a lot of scientists think that we're actually in the 6th mass extinction. So you're probably familiar with mass extinction. Think about, when the dinosaurs went extinct, or at the end of the last ice age when the mammoths and the saber-toothed cats went extinct, that level of mass extinction. We're currently in the 6th one, this one caused by people, and it is gearing up to be the worst one we've ever seen. So that's not great, but we know this from the fossil record. And let's take a look. So some fossils are not the actual remnants of organisms. Sometimes an organism will die and then the actual organism decomposes, but we get what's called a cast. And so we get kind of what's left behind in the sediment. Like if you take a look in the back, this is an ammonite. It's a 375 million year old fossil. cast of an ammonite, a shelled marine animal related to the present day nautilus. And I've mentioned in here that it's useful to compare to to current species. So I actually used to work down in Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, and I would go into the paleontology lab. By the way, paleontology is the study of non-human things, and archaeology is the study of things left by humans. And so I'd go into the paleontology lab, and when you first walk in the door, they have a horse skull, they have an armadillo, and they have an elephant skull. And you're like, why would you have these things? Well, turns out that there used to be 6-foot-tall giant sloths in San Diego. And they find the fossils of these 6-foot-tall giant sloths down in Anza-Borrego. And sometimes they're hard to put together. They don't know where the bones go. But armadillos are kind of like miniature versions of giant sloths. The bone structure is almost identical to the giant sloth. And so they can actually look at the armadillo and they can make inferences about what the giant sloth used to be like. Same for the elephant skull that represents the mammoth. And then horses represent horses. And also, you know what the most common fossil found down in Anza-Borrego is? It's camels. We used to have camels in San Diego. In fact, we think that camels originated in North America and then migrated over to where they are now, and they just became what's called extirpated in North America, so they're locally extinct. If you ever get a chance to go to the San Diego Zoo, walk through Elephant Odyssey, because Elephant Odyssey is this whole idea of a comparative collection. And so it's showing you what San Diego looked like, you know, thousands of years ago during the end of the last ice age. And so when mammoths and saber-toothed cats and 6-foot-tall giant sloths used to, you know, walk around San Diego, and, you know, we obviously can't have a 6-foot-tall sloth. We have a statue of it, but we have modern day sloth to represent them. You know, we can't have a mammoth, but we have the elephants to represent them. There are these really great pictures comparing and contrasting what it would have looked like then versus what it looks like now. But that's the whole idea of Elephant Odyssey at the San Diego Zoo, is that it's kind of taking you back in time, showing you what this area looked like using the modern day counterparts of those organisms. So the sequence in which fossils appear within strata, layers of sedimentary rock, is a historical record of life on Earth, because usually the new layers will form over the old ones. And so we're able to date a layer, and we'll know then approximately when those fossils are from. There's some like crazy things, like something like part of the Grand Canyon is flipped upside down because of some massive geological event. But usually they happen in layers, and the lower the layer, the older it is, and we can actually date those layers and figure out how old the fossils are within them. So paleontologists, scientists who study fossils, can sometimes gain access to very old fossils when erosion carves through the younger strata, which then reveals the deeper, the older strata, which have been buried for forever. And we're able to get our hands on new fossils quite often, which is very exciting. And the fossil record is the chronicle of evolution over millions of years of geologic time, engraved in the order in which fossils appear in the rock strata. And it's getting even more exciting now with DNA technology, because sometimes we're actually able to extract DNA from, from hair or fur, or, something in the bones that's left behind, and we can do genetic analysis on some of these organisms now, which is super exciting. And that's how we know that dinosaurs are very closely related to birds. And we even think now that a lot of the dinosaurs might have had feathers, which is super cool. So the fossil record is incomplete, right? We don't have a complete fossil record of every organism that ever lived, even every species that ever lived, because many of the Earth's organisms did not live in areas that favored fossilization. Fossils that did form were in rocks that were later distorted or destroyed, and not all fossils that have been preserved are even accessible to paleontologists. They might just be in areas that people can't get. So they are incomplete, but we're constantly finding new fossils and kind of piecing things together in order to create a fuller picture of what has happened over time. Now, this kind of leads to an exciting story about why I actually really like the Jurassic Park movies and Jurassic World. Because when Jurassic Park first came out, it was science fiction. And now that Jurassic World came out, it's kind of science reality, because we are able to extract DNA from some of the fossils that we find. But for some of you who are like, well, wait, teacher, you just said that dinosaurs probably had feathers and the dinosaurs in the movie did not have feathers, so it's not that accurate. Well, you probably missed it because it's like one line said super quickly in the middle of like this action-packed sequence in Jurassic World where they're inside the lab running from the dinosaurs, and the scientist actually addresses that and says, first of all, that when we're extracting DNA from these fossils, we don't get the complete genome, right? Because usually we're only getting pieces of the DNA, so we have to fill in the gaps with DNA from other organisms. And the other really good point is that, you know, it's an amusement park, and so they have to make the dinosaurs look like people expect them to look. That's why if you go to an aquarium today, it's all squeaky clean and geared towards the public, because the public expects certain things, and so in order to sell, in order to make money, they have to make it look like what the public thinks. And so I think that's really fascinating that he actually in that one line basically showed that, you know, Jurassic Park is kind of science reality now, and we're going to get into the conservation benefits of that a little bit later. There's some questions surrounding that, but we're gonna get in that in just a minute. But fossils of transitional forms support Darwin's theory of evolution. So in The Origin of Species, Darwin predicted the existence of fossils of what we call transitional forms, linking different groups of organisms. And so this is what you've probably heard referred to as the missing link. And so we have, you know, species A and species B, and we think that they're related, but there was probably something in between those two species. And so Darwin predicted that these transitional forms would exist. And we have found many of them. So we do often find missing links, which helps us to kind of piece things together. A good example of this is Darwin's hypothesis that whales evolved from land-dwelling mammals. If it was correct, then fossils should show a series of changes in a lineage of mammals adapted to a fully aquatic habitat. So there should be mammals fully on land, and then you should see some kind of transitional form that could be on land and in the water, and then the next one would be in the water, right? There should be something like that going on. So many fossils do link early extinct species with species living today. So a series of fossils traces the gradual modification of jaws and teeth in the evolution of mammals from a reptilian ancestor. There's a series of fossils that documents the evolution of whales from a group of land mammals. And thousands of fossil discoveries have since shed light on the evolutionary origins of many groups of plants and animals, including the transition of fish to amphibians, the origin of birds from a lineage of dinosaurs. The dinosaurs' most closely related living relative is like the chicken, and the evolution of mammals from a reptilian ancestor. So whales are what's called cetaceans. That's a group of organisms that also includes dolphins and porpoises. They have the forelimbs in the form of flippers. So these are forelimbs in the form of flippers, but lack hind limbs. If cetaceans evolved from a four-legged land animal who have both forelimbs and hind limbs, I'm not flexible enough to put in the camera, then transitional forms should have reduced hind limb and pelvic bones. So you should see the land mammals that have, you know, the arms and legs. You should see a transitional form that have the arms and little legs, and then the aquatic version that has just the forelimbs, which are now flippers instead of arms. Beginning in the late 1970s, paleontologists unearthed an extraordinary series of transitional fossils in Pakistan and Egypt. And the new fossil discoveries were consistent with the earlier hypothesis, and paleontologists became more firmly convinced that whales did indeed arise from a wolf-like carnivore, something like what's pictured here. Oh, but wait. Oh, here we go. So take a look at this real quick. So you'll notice the different colors represent the corresponding bone in all of these different animals. So we've got foot, and toe. nothing, right? Oh, but wait, here come the molecular biologists. They found, by looking at the DNA, a close relationship between whales and hippopotamuses, and hypothesized that whales and hippos were both descendants of a cloven-hoofed animal. So now you have the scientists who are studying fossils, so looking at morphology, right, how the body is arranged, and they're seeing a link between a land-dwelling mammal, a land-dwelling carnivore, and whales. But molecular biologists looking at the DNA are finding a connection between whales and hippos. So who's right? Oh, your favorite answer of all that I give, it depends on which scientist you ask. So there were two fossils discovered in 2001 that provided the answer, luckily for this one. So both of these two species had the distinctive ankle bone of a cloven-hoofed mammal, like what the molecular biologists found. Thus, as is often the case in science, scientists are becoming more certain about the evolutionary origin of whales as mounting evidence from different lines of inquiry converge. So basically what that means is we don't exactly know, because we do have the scientists studying morphology, studying the fossils, who are seeing one thing. Molecular biologists are seeing something a little bit different. They don't always agree. They don't always agree. And so there's actually quite a bit of debate in science about which one is more credible. And the answer right now is your favorite. And it kind of depends on who you ask. All right, so let's take a look at homologies. So we kind of actually just touched on homologies. They provide strong evidence for evolution. So evolution, change over time, is basically the process of descent with modification. That means that characteristics present in an ancestral organism are altered over time by natural selection as its descendants face different environmental conditions. And so we're not really creating anything new, we're editing what already exists. And so we already have a bunch of adaptations out in the gene pool, and whoever just so happens to be best adapted to the current environment is going to survive and reproduce more. So those genes are getting passed on. So we're not really creating anything new. We're just editing what already exists to match the current environment. So related species can have characteristics that have an underlying similarity yet function differently, because remember, we're editing what already exists. So it makes sense that we could actually make multiple edits on different organisms, and we can make a little different edit for different organisms. So if you take a look at this picture in the back, you'll see a human arm. We've got a cat, a whale, and a bat. You'll notice that structurally, they're actually fairly similar. You know, like take a look at that human hand and the whale flipper and even the bat, like they're very, very similar. But they're going to be doing different things. Like, I wish I could fly like a bat. I wish I could swim like a whale, but these hands don't really help me do either. But structurally, they're very, very similar. That's because back in the day, we shared a common ancestor, and these hands have just been edited over time to become human hands, where whales would have started with that same common ancestor, and that would have just been edited to become a flipper. And with bats, same thing. Shared a common ancestor, and then whatever that was got edited over time to become a bat hand in their wing. So similarity resulting from common ancestry is known as homology. And so when they're similar because they shared a common ancestor, but the adaptations do different things, that is called homology. So Darwin cited the anatomical similarities among vertebrate forelimbs, as evidence of common ancestry. So that was this picture we're just looking at. So Darwin actually took a look at this and he's like, oh, well, these actually look really similar. And so they probably at some point had a common ancestor. And we're going to take a look at that in the form of this evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. So biologists call such anatomical similarities in different organisms homologies or homologous structures. And that's what we were just talking about here. So you'll notice that you can even get more specific and you see that they are very, very similar, even though they're performing different functions, very, very similar structure. And molecular comparisons, here come the molecular biologists again, between diverse organisms have allowed biologists to develop hypotheses about the evolutionary divergence of major branches of the tree of life. So really, we use kind of a combination of both, of looking at morphology, the way that an organism's body is put together, and molecular comparisons looking at the DNA. So Darwin's boldest hypothesis was that all life forms are related. Everybody's related, it's all connected. And molecular biology actually provides pretty strong evidence for this claim. So all forms of life use the same genetic language of DNA and RNA, from viruses and bacteria to humans. We all use DNA and RNA. And so that's not really random, right? That's pretty strong evidence that at some point, we all come from a common ancestor, even if it's way, 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 way back in the day. And think about this, the genetic code, those codons, how RNA triplets are translated into amino acids during transcription and translation, is essentially universal. So all types of organisms, from very, very small organisms to humans, are doing transcription and translation using codons. So that's also pretty good evidence that at some point we all shared a common ancestor. And an understanding of homology helps explain why things like the early stages of development in different animal species reveal similarities not visible in adult organisms. And at some point in their development, all vertebrate embryos have a tail and a structure called the pharyngeal or throat pouches. So if you take a look in the background, take a look at this chick embryo, like a chicken, like a chick, and the human embryo. Notice they look very, very similar. And so sometimes people will look at like a chicken and a human and be like, they look nothing alike. How could you possibly suppose that they came from a common ancestor? Well, sometimes we don't see all the adaptations in the adult form, so we have to look at the embryos, but take a look, they look very similar, right? When you were a little embryo, you had a tail. You had these little throat pouches. You looked almost like a baby chicken. Oh, cute little baby chicken students. And some of the most interesting homologies are what we call leftover structures that are of marginal or perhaps no importance to the organism. You've probably heard these referred to as vestigial structures. They're remnants of features that served a purpose in the past, but they don't serve a purpose anymore. But we just haven't evolved to get rid of them yet. And homologies actually indicate patterns of descent that can be shown on what we call an evolutionary tree. So let's take a look. Darwin was the first to view the history of life as a tree with multiple branches from a common ancestral trunk to the descendant species at the tips of the twigs. So the farther down the trunk you get, the older it is. The higher up you get on the twigs, the newer the species is in terms of evolutionary time. Today, biologists represent these patterns of descent with an evolutionary tree, although today the tree is often turned sideways. So we're going to learn how to read these in just a minute. So homologous structures can be used to determine the branching sequence in an evolutionary tree, which can include both anatomical structure, the morphology I was talking about earlier, and molecular structure. So we're going to take a look at how to read these. So again, usually flipped on its side. So we have oldest on the left, newest on the right. Again, that's in terms of evolutionary time. When you get to the intersections of different lines here, that represents a common ancestor. And so it would be a common ancestor between everything to the right of it. And so here at number 1, everything over here is going to share this common ancestor. When we get over here, only ostriches, hawks, and the birds here are going to share this common ancestor, right? Because it's just the things branching off to the right. When we get over here, number 5, this is going to be what we call the most recent common ancestor of crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. Number 4 is going to be the most recent common ancestor of lizards and snakes, and crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. Right, so what number would represent the most recent common ancestor for amphibians, mammals, lizards and snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds? So it's going to be number 2. Right, so number 2 is going to be the most recent common ancestor of amphibians, mammals, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. All right, so even if these dots and numbers don't exist, assume that these intersections are a most recent common ancestor. All right, so that's one of the things you should know. Also, there are these notches that represent this, or these hatch marks that represent a homologous character shared by all the groups to the right of the mark. So this is a big evolutionary event where some really, really big important adaptation came about that separated them from the other groups. And so if you take a look down here, right, the most recent common ancestor of crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds is number 5. And what set ostriches, hawks, and other birds apart from crocodiles were feathers, right? We don't see crocodiles with feathers. And so this big evolutionary event, the big homologous character that set these ostriches, hawks, and other birds apart from crocodiles were feathers. So if you take a look back here, there was a big evolutionary event, a big adaptation that set mammals apart, or sorry, that set mammals, lizards, and snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds, that set all of these apart from amphibians. And because this is the most recent common ancestor, and so you'll notice amphibians branched off here. All of these things branched off and are separate from amphibians because amnion, which is something found in eggs, like amniotic fluid. And so when you see these hatch marks, that means that there was some big evolutionary event, some big adaptation that evolved that set all of these things apart from another group. So be able to read these, know what these most recent common ancestor, be able to find what the big evolutionary events were. And we can get really specific, we can get really broad. So this is an evolutionary tree of marine organisms. And so if you take a look on here, see if you can point to your screen. Where would the most recent common ancestor of Porifera, second from the top, Porifera, and then all the things below it, where's that most recent common ancestor? So here's Porifera, and then here's everything else. Where's the most recent common ancestor? Would be right here, right? And what was that big evolutionary event? What was the big adaptation that set Porifera, those are the sponges, by the way, that set the sponges apart from all of these other organisms? It'd be the next hatch mark, so it'd be tissues. So all these Cnidaria down to Echinodermata, they have tissues. Porifera, the sponges, do not. So that was the big evolutionary adaptation that set them apart. What about choanoflagellates up here at the top and everything else? Where's the most recent common ancestor? Yeah, so it's going to be over here. And what set it apart? What's the big evolutionary adaptation that sets choanoflagellates apart from everything else? The fact that all of these other things are multicellular. Good. Here's another one. Right. Where is the most recent common ancestor of tunicates and everything else? That'd be here. And what was the evolutionary adaptation that set all these other things apart from tunicates? Brain, or tunicates don't have a brain. What about, where is the most recent common ancestor of lampreys and everything else? So that's going to be here. And what was the big evolutionary adaptation that set all of these things, the sharks, skates, rays, down to mammals, apart from the lampreys? Here's the most recent common ancestor. Big evolutionary adaptation was jaws. And look at that, you can just keep going and keep going and keep going. Ooh, look at Okapi, I love Okapis. It was just World Okapi Day. All right, so now you should be able to explain how Darwin's voyage on the Beagle influenced his thinking. Explain why the concept of evolution is regarded as a theory of great significance. Evolution is a thing, my friends. You will be tested on that. It's a thing. Explain how fossils form and why the fossil record is incomplete. Explain how homologies, the fossil record, and molecular biology support evolution, and be able to read evolutionary trees, know how they're constructed, and how they're used to represent ancestral relationships. That is the end of this lecture. I will see you for the next one.